Hello boys and girls, it's Navonod on No Limit Hold'em. In this video we're going to be discussing range construction. We're going to take a look at constructing ranges efficiently. The idea is, or cliche is really, waste not, want not, and a place for everything and everything in its place ought to come to mind. I think it's just a fact that elegance is a hallmark of good range construction. If this is a concept you've not been introduced to, yeah, it's easy enough to understand. I don't think I've ever really heard anybody talk about it either, but it's at least implicit if you hear anyone talking who really knows what they're doing about how to play different parts of the range. The efficiency guideline might not be really like stated, or at least not overstated, but it is implicit, it's implied, right? And when we're talking about efficiency, I think there's three major and really four overall factors that we can keep an eye on and just keep in mind when we're constructing, especially the cuspier hands in our range. We're thinking about adding or subtracting a couple of hands from any given range, or also if we're deciding between becoming aggressive or like maybe we're in a spot where we can either overlimp or iso raise, or we can either flat call or 3-bet, or if we're just thinking about adding a couple of hands into our open raising range from under the gun at 6 max no limit hold'em. In any of those spots, understanding these things and remembering these things, it should help you, I think, quite a bit. So these kind of guiding principles are going to be hand anatomy, like knowing where the value comes from in the cards that you decide to play and why you would play. I mean, it's one thing to say that I'm usually going to play Queen Jack suited from whatever position, and I'm usually not going to play King 5 offsuit in that same position under those same circumstances. It's one thing to know that that's the case, but it's another thing to understand why it's the case. And if you understand why, then decisions on whether you should overlimp it, flat call it, 3-bet it, or iso raise it, or just open fold it, or fold it versus an aggressive action, become more simple. Where you're not just trying to memorize some kind of set of rules, but you actually have your head around it conceptually. So understanding where the value of your starting cards comes from when you're moving post-flop, going to the flop, I think is very helpful. Understanding the advantages of polarization, of polarizing ranges when you have the opportunity to, and that's going to be oftentimes when you're in position, or some of the times you're able to use polarization kind of at will, as long as your opponent's not going to punish you for it. You can do this with like your check raising ranges, or in certain circumstances you could use a polarized 3-betting range even when you're out of position, but your opponent being in position, he's able to stifle that. So understand the advantages of polarization, understanding when you can get away with using it and when you probably shouldn't, and understanding the way that polarization helps inject efficiency into your overall game plan by way of allowing you to play more hands profitably. And start to think about blocker effects, understanding that the hand that you have does not matter if there's not a showdown. And so if you're thinking about 3-betting a hand and you're hoping to not get 4-bet, and you're hoping that your opponent doesn't flat call you, oftentimes ace 3 suited or ace 5 offsuit's going to perform more or less the same as ace 10 suited would. So maybe it would make more sense to just 3-bet the ace 5 suited or ace 5 offsuit, ace 2 suited, because you still have the ace blocker. So if we're really just concerned with folding our opponent's equity out, and we don't expect him to do a lot of flat calling, we expect him to play, say, a 4-bet or fold game, then very often a hand like I said, ace 10 suited, if you're going to 3-bet it and then you're just going to fold it to a 4-bet, the only value that it has in helping you to fold out your opponent's equity is that it does have a blocker to the ace. Well, so does ace 5 suited, and so if you're in a spot where you want to flat call some hands, you want to 3-bet some hands, it probably, oftentimes can make more sense to add hands like ace 10 suited and king and queen and pocket 9s to your flat calling range, and to 3-bet hands that are not profitable enough to call with. And in that way, you're going to be able to use more hands and play more hands profitably. So thinking about blocker effects, especially with regard to your 3-betting range, and understanding the advantage of polarizing, the advantages of polarization can take you pretty far. And then understanding and utilizing the concept of board coverage and range advantage to guide your overall range construction is another way we're going to help to inject efficiency into our range construction. Okay, so on the idea of where our post-flop value comes from. So I think there's four main factors. You've got domination, nut potential, synergy, and showdown value. Domination refers to the chances that you're going to make the best hand when your opponent makes the second best hand. We're going to be talking, when we're talking about domination, the hands that have the best domination ratings are going to be hands like pocket aces, kings, queens, ace, king, to a lesser degree, ace, queen, and king, queen, basically the premium hands. And because where the value comes from is twofold. Number one, when you dominate your opponent, it's very unlikely that they win. And number two, if you have your opponent's pre-flop hand dominated, then when you both hit the flop, you will have made the best hand when your opponent makes a good second best hand. So there's implied odds that occur relatively often. Nut potential refers to a hand's relatively high chance of flopping nutted value hands. The pocket pairs come to mind. Some of the ace X suited hands like ace Broadway suiteds and ace wheel suiteds come to mind. If you have potential to hit the flop in a really big way, where you're going to have just massive implied odds, where you're not only going to get value from the second best hands that the dominating hands will get value from, but you'll also get value from the hands that are dominating parts of your perceived range, then there's a lot of value in that, when it does occur. Then synergy or connectivity is, the way that the two cards that you're starting with work together, and the more synergistic or connected that your cards are, the more ways you have to flop equity on a given flop. And there's a couple of things kind of everybody knows about like suited connector type hands like 9-8 suited and even Jack 10 suited and some of the suited Broadways, King Queen suited, have good synergy and connectivity. One of the great things about these hands that I never hear anybody talk about, one of the things I love most about these hands is the way they allow you to tailor-make a strategy, to create a strategy specifically for a given opponent. Like if you have a very synergistic hand, like maybe 10-9 suited, and you enter a pot in some way, pre-flop, against a very passive calling station type opponent who makes very small bets, takes too many pot control lines, but then he can't fold a big hand, so he's just loose passive. Then you can play, say you flop a big draw, like a open-ended straight flush draw. Well, against that opponent, you can play kind of a check and call strategy and expect him to check back some streets and give you some free cards, and then when you do hit your hand, he's going to pay you off in a big way, so you'll have massive implied odds. But against a player that's more like a tag or a nit, you might take the exact same hand, be in the exact same situation, and decide to check raise instead, because you're taking advantage of the fact that that opponent makes too many folding mistakes. So against player A, who's making too many calling mistakes and he's not betting his hand correctly, you want to play maybe this hand, or this hand having this synergistic connectivity is going to allow you to take maximum advantage of whatever your opponent is doing incorrectly. So that's one of the things I love about synergistic hands, and I think that it's one of the reasons why some players will choose to play these hands from some positions and some players choose to not play them, and why some players will add hands like 6-5 suited to their re-steal 3 betting range, and some players would prefer a hand like ace-5 suited. I really think it comes down to how good you are at getting into your opponent's head and knowing what your opponent does wrong and manipulating him, and using these synergistic hands gives you a little bit more opportunity to do just that. Last, and actually probably least, is showdown value. Showdown value, just what we mean, or what I mean when I talk about a hand's inherent showdown value, is the chances that you can get that hand to showdown and have it be the best hand unimproved. So, maybe you're in a spot where you're thinking about taking a set mine, you're not sure if you ought to or not, and you've got pocket twos. Well, you don't have a lot of intrinsic or inherent showdown value in pocket twos, but there's some. So maybe you fold in that spot, but in the same spot, maybe a tight, aggressive player raises from under the gun in a full ring cash game and you're in the big blind. Maybe you've got, with pocket twos, you feel like it's a fold, but with pocket nines, not only do you have good set mining potential, but you also have some showdown value built into the hand, so that's going to allow you to maybe peel a couple of flops and maybe get to a couple more rivers and win just a few more small pots without improving your hand. And that little bit of difference can make enough difference to tip what would be a fold into a call in a spot where you're otherwise just looking to take a set 9. So that's where the value comes from. Okay, and polarization. Polarization is another concept that is going to help us with efficiency. If you're polarizing your ranges, you're getting, you're allowing yourself to play as many hands profitably as possible, and that's really the idea of efficiency. And the way we're doing it is by not wasting hands. So, for instance, pre-flop, if a player open raises in late position and you have a hand that is ahead of his range, but just marginally ahead of his range, and it kind of splits the gap between the hands that he's likely to call you with if you 3-bet and the hands that he's going to open raise, then you probably have a good flat call, because you know, when you're 3-betting, you really want to be able to get called by some worse hands, and you want to get, or you want some better hands to fold or be able to fold. So polarization is the idea that you're going to take the best hands in your range, and you're going to raise with those or get aggressive with those, and you're going to take the worst hands in your range, the hands that are at the very bottom of your calling range or the top of your folding range, and you're going to get aggressive with those, more or less. Or you're going to pick the best hand for the situation that's not quite good enough to call with, and you're going to get aggressive with it. So polarizing means we're going to have a lot of really strong stuff and a lot of really weak stuff and not a lot of stuff in the middle. And we should polarize our aggressive ranges whenever we're allowed to. It's really the right of the player who's in position the ability to polarize your ranges is one of the ways that a positional advantage can manifest itself. For instance, if we're in a cash game and you open raise and I 3-bet you from in position, I can have a polarized range and there's really nothing you can do to stop me. But if I'm out of position, let's say you're the button, I'm the big blind, and you open raise, it's hard for me to polarize or get away with polarizing a 3-bet range, because you can do a lot to hurt me just by hitting the call button, you know, just by calling a lot. I mean, that's really one of the easiest ways is to, well, I mean, you can do more than that even, because as the player that's in position, you can widen your calling range, and then you can develop a polarized or open a polarized 4-betting range, and that puts me in all the bind in the world. So polarization is actually the right of the player who's in position, but we should maybe try to use polarization whenever we're playing against an opponent or we're in a specific spot where our opponent is unlikely to punish us for it. So one spot that comes to mind is my check raising ranges are almost always polarized, and you know, you could ask, well, can't your opponent make that backfire if he's in position, which he obviously is if you're check raising him? The answer is yes, but most players don't know how to or are unwilling to accept the additional variance. Another way polarizing your ranges can help you out is in dealing with 4-bets, because if you start out with a polarized 3-betting range, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out which parts of your range you want to continue with. If you're sufficiently polarized, you maybe can just continue with the entirety of the value end of your polarized 3-betting range against a 4-bet and just drop the bluffs out. Blocker effects are not huge most of the time, but in situations where ranges are pretty tight and narrow, blockers can make all the difference in the world. And when you're in a spot that's really, really close, and you should probably be playing a mixed strategy, like you get to the river with some kind of bluff catcher that's it's like really right on the borderline of being a profitable call or not. Just taking into consideration blocker effects can not only keep you using about the right percentages, so your opponent has a hard time getting a beat on you and really exploiting you, but they just make you unpredictable, hard to play against. And if you are in a situation that's about 0 EV, then just adding in one extra factor to consider can turn that 0 EV spot into pure profit. So an understanding pre-flop or at any spot, if your opponent folds, your hand doesn't matter, but having blockers can increase your fold equity. So I think we already talked about this a little bit, but ace 10 and ace 3 can very often be the same hand when you 3-bet them. So in a spot where maybe you want to have some flat calls and you want to have some 3-bets, and you're not anticipating getting flat called very often, and you know you're going to fold either of these hands to a 4-bet, it can make a lot of sense to shift ace-10, especially ace-10 suited, into a flat calling range, and use the ace-3, especially ace-3 suited, as a 3-bet. They both have the ace blocker. Okay, board coverage. Covering more boards allows you to leverage a range advantage that you might have on any given flop or board by having bluffs where it's hard for you to get action. Covering more boards can get you paid off in a couple of different ways, and in some big ways. It can help you get paid off when your opponent, especially when you're deep and when you're playing against a good player who understands ranges and can hand read and thinks they understand your ranges. If you're in a spot where your opponent never expects you to have it, there's a lot of value in having it. You know, let's say you've been opening a really tight range for the last couple hours, and a good player is kind of making life difficult for you. And so you decide to throw some suited connectors and maybe some ace-x suited and splash a few more pairs into your under-the-gun open raising range in a full ring cash game. And so you open raise 7-6 suited from under the gun, and your very good aggressive opponent who's very deep with you flat calls you from the button, and you guys go heads up to the flop of 7-6-6. He can be in a lot of trouble there. So using these kinds of hands, like if you're going to splash in a couple extra hands and you're thinking, well, you know, maybe I should add a hand like 10-9 suited, if you're thinking about adding 10-9 suited, but that's going to cover a lot of the same boards as a hand like Queen-Jack suited would, then maybe it would make more sense for you to use a hand like 7-6 suited instead of 10-9 suited. Yes, 10-9 suited is objectively stronger, but, you know, realistically, they're both going to perform about the same in terms of actually playing out a hand of poker, depending on stack depth, I suppose. But in general, 7-6 suited is going to perform about the same as 10-9 suited, but it's going to hit boards that 10-9 suited just won't hit. And whereas 10-9 suited is going to have some overlap with some of the other hands in your range, probably, 7-6 suited won't. And so if we go to the flop of, like, say we raise from under the gun at a full ring game, and the flop comes out something like ace, queen, 10, the 7-6 suited gives you an opportunity to really leverage that range advantage by betting when you have, like, no equity. So it gives you the opportunity to take advantage of a spot where it's hard for you to get value. Whereas, like, and the other end of it, I should say, is when you actually do hit the board, it's going to be more likely for you to get paid off because your opponents are going to call you down thinking you're bluffing more, and they might actually get crazy and start putting a lot of pressure on you when you aren't supposed to be able to have it. So, yeah, using board coverage to guide what are the cusp hands that you're going to include to your ranges just helps put some extra value to your overall strategy. Okay, in conclusion, understanding what the factors are that generate value post-flop is going to help you create good ranges. You know, knowing that domination rating is going to help you when the SPR is lower because you're going to flop frequent strength, and when you have a top pair, good kicker type hand, it's going to be fine to go to the flop because you won't have enough depth behind or enough stack behind to really worry about reverse implied odds. But that little bit of implied odds that you get can make it a very plus EV situation. Understanding that these types of hands that have good domination ratings play best heads up. That kind of knowledge is going to help you to know when you should take an aggressive line or take more of a passive line on any spot, but especially pre-flop. Board coverage matters. When all things are equal, use the hands that cover boards that the rest of your range doesn't cover. Use that to break ties if you're not sure if you should or should not splash this particular hand into that particular range. Understand that polarization generates efficiency by removing waste. Waste is the opposite of efficiency, right? Well, if you kind of accidentally turn a good hand into a bluff, you've wasted it. So polarizing generates efficiency by removing waste. And you should utilize it whenever you're allowed to utilize it. Blocker effects should not be ignored. Now, you can go overboard with this, but use blocker effects when you're kind of splitting ties, when you're thinking about, well, this is a really close spot, maybe I should fold, maybe I should call. Look what your hand blocks. If your hand blocks a bunch of your opponent's bluffing range, fold it. If it blocks a bunch of your opponent's value range, call with it. And pre-flop, having that blocker increases your fold equity, because if you have an ace in your hand, it's less likely your opponent has 2 aces in their hand. If your hand is never going to get to showdown anyway, then that's the most important thing. It's not going to increase your fold equity by a tremendous amount, but again, if you're never going to take this hand to showdown, nothing else matters. The only thing that matters is how you block your opponent's ability to continue. That's it. So ace-3 offsuit and ace-10 suited might be the same hand, but if you can use ace-10 suited as a profitable call, then you can use ace-3 offsuit as a 3-bet instead, and that increases the overall number of hands that you have in your range. So you're increasing the number of hands that you have in your range. You're using board coverage so that all of the hands in your range have as much value as they could, because your overall range is working well together. And you're understanding what factors help determine what hands should go where. If you get your head around all of these things, I think you'll be doing just fine. Until next time, guys, Navonod over and out. Good